All right, so in this one, we're going to talk about the Bootstrap grid system a little bit, so our Django project can look a little better than it currently does. This, of course, is really just talking about the Bootstrap whole front-end framework, so even if you're not using Django, this stuff will definitely apply. So what we've done so far is, if we take a look at the code, we can first off look at the main content container. So our main content container is right here. It's all this stuff. So I'm going to go ahead and tab in the Jumbotron. This content container is of the class container. So if we look at the result of this, is we see that it's basically right in the middle. It's got a nice padding on either side, and it allows us to kind of work with this document a little bit more on how well a lot of websites typically are right now. And if we even look at the container itself, while we inspect the element, we see that it's 1170 pixels wide, as you see right here. So as it breaks down, it will still maintain a certain amount of padding depending on the size of the actual browser or the device that's looking at it. So it goes down to 750 and so on. So if we wanted to make it a little bit of a fuller page, so if we wanted it to be full page, both the nav bar and the main content area, we would change this container to being container-fluid. So if I refresh in here, it gets to this fluid layout. So if you haven't watched our other setups for the Django stuff, what we're working off of is the example in getting started. We have this example tool right here of this static nav bar. So that's more or less the code that we're working off of, in case you missed that. So going back in here, we see this now. It is nice and fluid, and it's going all the way across. So looking at our form itself, this is still a fourth of the whole document. Because if we look at home.html, we have, when it's at the minimum size of medium, we have it being 3 columns wide, which being that it's 12 columns all the way across, it's going to be a fourth. Right, so that's a way to have it fluid. Now, our nav bar is not showing a fluid layout itself, so we actually need to update that as well. So if we go into navbar.html, we want to look for that same container. So container, and we want to do dash fluid here. So this allows us to have a full screen page, and it's going to change depending on the size of the document, or the browser, or the of course, mobile device or whatever device is looking on it, which is cool. So this is very much closer to being the exact same thing the entire time. So you have a better feeling of what it's going to be like when it's mobile as well. So this is not going to work for every concept, but a lot of ones that you would be working on, it might work out very well as far as what your end goal is. For us, we're going to leave it at the fluid container because it's virtually the exact same thing, but we want to look at the grids a little bit more. So let's go back into Bootstrap, and we're going to just click on the grid system. I do recommend that you read through this. It does kind of clarify it even further, but that's what we're going to be doing here, is clarifying things as much as possible. And it uses media queries. So media queries is a CSS markup that allows you to change certain attributes of your site based off of the size of the browser or all types of things. So as you see here, you can actually do additional media queries based off of some Bootstrap stuff as well. But let's scroll down and we look at this example, horizontal or stack to horizontal. This is what we want to work with. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this. And in this case, I want to actually set up a new view so we can kind of see how this stuff works, or just a new template. So I'm going to go into templates and save it as example fluid.html, and I'm going to paste this row in here. But with template inheritance in Django, we have to do extends base.html, and then we want to do block content and end block, and then the Jumbotron block, we want to do block Jumbotron and in block. I'm just going to put a little underscore there. Okay, so let's go back into our view. We want to change this home to example underscore fluid. And let's go back in our home page and we refresh in here. That underscore is at the very top to just get rid of the Jumbotron. And this is really showing us kind of how these columns work. So if I break it down, once it gets to that medium size, just slightly below that, which is considered small, this is a small size now, it's going to make everything 12. They default to being 12 wide. So to change what it is at any size of the browser, we have to go into here and add additional classes. So I'm actually going to get rid of this first row because I don't want the 12 across each time. Instead, I want to see how we can experiment with these. So column medium 8. Now, what if when it's small, instead of it going down to 8, we want it to go up to 2, or excuse me, go down to 6 and the other one down to 6. So like each column down to 6. So if I refresh in here, I see column 8 and column small or medium 4. I'm even going to get rid of the bottom one. So I'm going to comment these out with command / or control / depending on where you are. And I refresh. So now I just have these two columns. One's 8, one's 4. And of course, if I break it down to small, it's going to go 12. That's basically what happens, is when it gets to small, it goes 12 across. So I can add this additional attribute of column small, and now I can tell it what I want it to be when it's small or, well, small or up to extra small. So now that I have it at small being 6, once I break it down, it then goes to being half, half, and half. And we can see this by going into inspect element. And we see in here that now the width is 50%. And it's, of course, 50% of whatever it's in. So in this case, it's in the row. So it's going to be 50% of that row. So that's even easier to tell if we add some inline style sheets. So I'm just going to add color of red, or let's say background color, not color. So background color red. And then the one below it, I'll just add blue. So we can see this. Now this is a little bit easier to see. We've got this 8-column spread here and then a 4-column spread. So now if I break it down, it goes half and half. And the padding, everything, it's showing it correctly, right? So the text is padded in a little bit. So that's why you're seeing it in there. It does have a little bit of padding. But for overall, it's 50-50. And if we got rid of the fluid container and refreshed, it just changes it slightly. But it changes it in a way that's fairly good for us. Okay, so let's leave that container fluid and go back into example fluid. All right, so now when I said it's half of whatever it's in, that means that I can actually put columns inside of another column. So if I did div class equals to row, closed off the div, notice that these are inside of this column itself, which is inside of another row. And I did this exact same thing, more or less. So I'm going to go ahead, let's just copy 2 of these down here, paste these in, and I'm going to change these to being 6 on medium. And then on small, I'll do column small, let's say 8, and then column small and 4. Because again, these numbers, whatever size it is, has to add up to 12. That's how it has to be. All right, so inside of here, I'm going to add some background colors, and we'll use orange and yellow. Let's copy this again, and yellow. Okay, so let's take a look at this. So I refresh in here. I now have a thicker row. So this row right here is thicker. So let's actually add in a new row inside of this one too to balance each side. So I'm going to do the same thing, but I'm going to just leave it as 12. So I'm going to get rid of this and change it to 12. And that one is going to be purple. Okay. And so now we see the colors coming quite different, right? So these are all together. So if I break this down, break it down, notice the yellow column. Notice how it changes, right? It changes to being a lot smaller relative to everything else. Even though when it's wider, it's half and half, right? So it's 6 and 6. So that's really what's going on here. So when we break it down, it's going to change. Now, of course, this is Bootstrap related. You could do this with CSS otherwise, but it gets a little bit more complicated and it's a little bit harder on you, and there's a lot more work you need to do. So it's a lot easier to use something like Bootstrap, especially for something like this, even if you want to customize it. So there you go. And then why is it going all the way across here? That's because we don't have a setting for extra small. So if I added extra small in here and I said column extra small, and then let's reverse it, and I'll say column extra small is 2 here, and then 10 here, it's going to change how our orange and yellow are going to look. So I'm going to go ahead and just save it in here, refresh, and then I'm going to collapse down. And notice once I got to 12 or extra small, notice it changes quite a bit. And this red right here is coming from this medium, right? So it's actually changing it quite a bit. And the reason that red is there is because this part is inside of that. It's not next to it or below it. It's actually inside it, and that's why you see that. So it's still part of that element is the point. So you could also have something, another row in here, or another column or div in here that would actually show that stuff. But I'm not going to go into all the spacing inside of it. The more important part here is seeing how this stuff's all broken down. Because this concept itself is probably one of the key parts of learning and understanding the grid without the other parts. Like, so if we look in the CSS in general, let's just look at some typography stuff. Here, this is fairly straightforward. You could just copy and paste this code and see the result. Where the grid, it's a little bit more of an abstract concept. So it's kind of harder to understand what exactly is going on, right? So lead body copy, right? It's going to render like this by adding that class of lead using the paragraph tags. That's fairly straightforward. Again, it's something you can play with, and it's something we'll do a little bit, but a lot of the stuff outside of this main grid concept, that's what you're going to see. Okay, so what's cool about grids is they can have as many subgrids as you want. So if I just copy this exact same thing and put it inside of this column small 4, right, put it in here, it's going to work just the same way. But it's inheriting from whatever parent column or whatever it is in the parent itself. And that's how this is going to change. So I'll change this to, let's say, green and blue. And then we'll refresh in here. Notice it appears to make a full another row on the bottom, but it's not. So this red part right here is related to this, where these things are half of this, right? So it's getting a little complicated. And if you weren't really following along, it makes it even that much harder. But if we break it down, still going to keep that red, still going to stay. And then when I really break it down, look at this. This is awkward, right? So it's just kind of a weird thing. So you're not going to want to do too much of these like columns inside of columns inside of columns. It's craziness. It's going to get too complicated for you to manage, and also there's no real reason for it. So the question then might be like, well, this is starting to look a lot like a table. And in a way it is like a table, although there are ones specifically for tables. So there is a table class that breaks down and works fairly well for tables on mobile too. So you can try this same sort of thing out for tables, but you're not going to want to get too much into this as far as how we have it. Right? You're not going to want to have rows inside of rows or rows inside of columns inside of columns. You're not going to want to do that. At the most you'd probably do is 2 levels. So like what we have here, which is like this. Right? That's probably the most you'll end up wanting to do. If you need to do more than that, I would recommend kind of rethinking how you're going to actually set this stuff up. But the cool thing about this is these elements, the div class of column, this stuff right here, works everywhere. Works on the nav bar. It works on the Jumbotron. So the Jumbotron example we had. So Jumbotron, it works there. It will work inside of tables. So if we look at Bootstrap, if we had tables inside of here, we would have the same sort of div class. And again, it's inheriting from its parent container. So in our case of example fluid, the parent container here is actually this container fluid, right? So that's where it's inheriting. So if we got rid of that container fluid, it would just be regular container, and then that would come down to that. But if we changed it even more, let's say in the block content is where this stuff is being rendered, we'll say div class equals to column small 6 or 5, and then we close this off. it changes everything again, right? So, and you can do that. You can constantly do that, but I wouldn't recommend doing it too much, like I said. It does get confusing and just a little jumbled. Okay, cool. So the other side of this is realizing that using this stuff is based off of the size of the screen. So a second ago I did column small 6. So if you mostly want it to always be half of the screen, then you would want to default to something, right? So anything greater than a small size will always be 6. So let's show you an example of that. I'm going to grab this orange one and I'm going to put it above everything and say div class equals to row first. Close out that row, add in this orange one. Okay, so refresh. Now it's showing it up top. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and get rid of all this stuff and say column small, or first off, we'll do column LG 12. So column large 12. So if it's a large size, it's going to be 12. If it's a small size, it's going to be 12. So no matter what, it's 12. You could say the exact same thing, but do extra small being 12. So small, extra small, 12. It's always 12, no matter what. So those two don't really matter. In fact, MD doesn't even matter. If it's 12, it's going to be 12. So whatever you put there, it's always going to be 12. So the question is when does it go back to being 12? So if we did column LG, let's say 10, then as soon as it's lower than being a large screen, it should break down to being 12. There we go. So that's about a medium screen, medium size browser, and then it goes down to being 12. So it defaults to 12 if you don't have a setting below it. So meaning setting below it, meaning column MD, SM, and XS. So if you always want it to be a certain size, then you would want to do XS as the size that you would default to. Because then anything above that, no matter what, it's going to be half. It's going to be 50% of the side. So that's going to be true for 3 or 1. It doesn't really matter. But the idea here is that if you want it to be a certain size for sure, or a certain percentage of the grids, then you want to set that at XS3. Because if we did it even at SM3, as soon as it gets to extra small screen size, it goes all the way across. It becomes 12 again. So that's a key thing as well. So like when you're doing this, I definitely recommend exactly what we're doing here is just play around with it on your own and kind of see if you could add these background colors and see exactly what's happening. Of course, you could do this stuff with content actually in it so you can see how your content changes. And of course, you would want to test that once you actually bring it live. But as far as understanding the grid concept, hopefully this was enough for you. But really, you're not going to fully grasp it, I think, until you actually play around with it on how it actually works. And one other thing is this inspect element should be your friend. So when you go into inspect element, you can actually click on any element itself. Inspect element is in Chrome, it's in Firefox and Safari. You might need to turn on developer stuff for Firefox or Safari, but in Chrome it comes in by default. And once you inspect an element, you can see the actual CSS for it. So what's actually going on? As you notice, column small 3 automatically has a width of 25%. You can do the math in your head, or you can know that column small 3 is 1/4 of 12, so it's 25%. It's always going to be 25%. Unless you have other attributes, like I said, or other classes that handle the different viewport size, or the different size of your browser or mobile device. Okay, so if you have any questions on grid stuff, let me know. There is quite a bit more in the documentation that you can play around with related to CSS, and I definitely recommend that you do. And there are other components that you can also play around with, and these things we do depending on whether or not our project needs it. So the project's at joincfe.com, so that's joincfe.com. That will redirect you to Coding for Entrepreneurs, and all of our projects there, we use various components depending on what they need. But as you may see in here, there's something called navbar. Well, we already have a navbar. We have one already in there. As you can see in the example, that looks exactly like our navbar. That's because it is. And if your drop down here is not working, that's because your JavaScript is not coming in correctly. And that would be these two right here. Those are the main ones. Those are not coming correctly. Or if you're on a Surface or Windows 8, then you want to make sure that the viewport JavaScript is coming in correctly too. So yeah, and that's also true if you break this down and you click on this. If this is not coming down, that's because your JavaScript is not working correctly. That is a question that's often asked when getting errors with Bootstrap. And then you can just keep going down, and there's all sorts of things you can do here. And luckily with Bootstrap, they give you a lot of this code so you can play around with it yourself. But like I said, on joincfe.com, we actually do implement a lot of these things as they're needed. Okay, so if you have any questions again on Bootstrap, let us know. Otherwise, we will see you in the next one.